Hi there, my name is Sean Longhurst. I'm the product lead for Conductor4SQL, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to configure the first few clients of SQL instances that you'll be using Conductor4SQL on. This is the second video in the series, so if you want to know how to install the central server, install the MSI, please watch the previous video in this series. As always, please be sure to watch this video in full screen and at a decent quality so you can see all the details of what I'm doing. Right, so let's get started. As I mentioned in the previous video, there are a few prerequisites for the instances of SQL Server that you actually want to use Conductor4SQL on. The first one is that they need to be 2005 Service Pack 3 or higher. They can be any version from Express upwards. They need to be running mixed mode authentication, and the server from which you're installing the instances of SQL must have network connectivity to those client instances. And you need Windows or SQL credentials that have sysadmin rights in order to install those clients. And don't worry, that's simply for the install. You don't need the sysadmin privileges afterwards. It's just to make the install nice and easy. So let's cross over. I'm now on the Conductor4SQL Central server. So I'm going to start the application by clicking on the shortcut on the desktop. I'll enter the credentials. These are the same as when you did the actual install itself. And then the Conductor application will launch. Just to clarify, when we say that we are installing Conductor4SQL clients, what we mean by that is you're actually just configuring or setting up your SQL environment so that you can use it for Conductor4SQL. Obviously, SQL already been installed on those other servers. You are just entering the config and the setup information required for Conductor to work in your SQL environment. It's a very lightweight installation. As mentioned in the earlier video, you do not have to actually go to those services or install any software on them. Everything you can do from the central server, as long as obviously it has network connectivity. And all we do is we create a small database in SQL Server on the other side to do everything we need to do. So it's very lightweight. So there's two ways you can go about configuring instances of SQL Server in your environment to use Conductor4SQL on. The first one is a basic client, SQL client install, and this is when you want to install clients one by one. So to do that, it's very simple. You just click on the top left-hand file menu and you say add client. The little install window comes up. All you have to do here is put in the SQL server name, if it's a default instance, or the named instance name, or the IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the first client. I've got a list here of SQL instances. I'm going to show you how I can also use this to do a bulk install a little bit later on. So I'm going to grab the name of the first SQL instance. As you can see, this is a named instance. So I have the server name / the SQL instance name. Conductor supports default instances or named instances or multiple named instances on any server. Next is a question whether this is a reinstall. This will be covered in a later video. This is not a reinstall. It's the first time installing this. Next, you need to provide the Windows or SQL credentials that have got sysadmin rights within SQL Server on that instance. So I'm going to choose SQL authentication. I'm going to use the good old SA password. Next is the port number. This is very important. That is the default port that our application will use. However, it's configurable. You can put any port number you like in there. Very important note is you need to ensure that if there is a firewall or firewalls between this central server and that instance of SQL, that the port you put here does allow traffic between the two servers. Group information and dynamic database expression I'll also cover a bit later on. So then you can test the connection. You can see it's successful, and once it's successful, the install option becomes available. As soon as I click install, you'll see Conductor4SQL is going to run a few prerequisites. We're doing things like checking that the SQL version is supported and so forth. If it passes all the checks, then you'll get this window which allows you to start the install. Just click on the start button. If you get any errors during this part of the install, please be sure to contact us on our support@conductorforsql.com email address. Another important thing to note, this second last step there, which is called check for opening message, if it hangs there or the installation stops there, that normally always has to do with a port issue. It means usually that there's a firewall between this central server and your other instances in your SQL environment, and the port that you've put in there when you install the client hasn't been opened correctly. Right, so now I've installed my first SQL client. So if I go into the UI now and I click the little magnifying glass on the central icon, we'll now get our dashboard. And the second option on the left-hand menu, which is called Central Client Overview, if I click on it, that lists all the instances of SQL that you have set up or configured within Conductor for SQL, like you just did for the first one now, or I did. So you can see that first instance is there with a lot of useful information, which I'll explain later on as well. So the next thing that you can do, which is very useful, is do a bulk installation. So typically Conductor for SQL would be used on quite a large SQL environment. You may have hundreds or even thousands of instances of SQL that you want to use Conductor for SQL on. So you'd have to set them all up in Conductor. If you do it one by one, this can be time consuming. That's why we've got the bulk installer. So how do you use the bulk installer? Well, this is covered in our technical documentation, but all you need to do is you need to go onto the central instance of SQL that you've set up Conductor for SQL on. There will be our database called SyncWorks, and inside that database is a table called cm_bulk_installer. Now, what you can do is, if your organization has got all the information around its SQL instances, the names of the servers, the names of the SQL instances, all you need to do is populate this table with all of that information, and you can do this using SSIS or using any sort of data import feature in SQL. Many ways to populate this table, whatever makes most sense to you. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to actually insert that information into the table. So I'm inserting 4 rows into that table. Simply, it just has the SQL server name as well as the root. The root is just the either the server name that the SQL's installed on, the DNS name, or they can also be alternatively the IP, as well as the port. The rest of the fields you can leave empty. That we just use for our install purposes. So if you run that insert, and then do a select from the table, you will see that that information is there. So once you've imported your SQL Server environment information that we require into this table, you can go back to the user interface again. You can once again click on File in the top left hand side, and now you can choose the option for Bulk Add Client. If you select that, you can now see the information that I entered in that table actually here in the user interface. So the first thing what you would want to do is run our checker, our install checker. And in the top left hand corner you see a little checker button. The installer button is grayed out. Only once the checker is run does the install option become available for you. So I'm going to go ahead and click the checker, and it's going to go through each instance of SQL that you told it to and check that everything's okay with when it comes to the prerequisites. So you just have to click the little start button on the left hand side, and you'll see the lights are going green. If the lights don't go green and they go orange or red, as in this example, it'll actually tell you what the issue is with that server. So you can see there it's telling you that the current user is not in the sysadmin group. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the bulk installer, and how the bulk installer works is if one of those has an error like that one, it will not install that one. It'll only install the ones that had the green light. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to click on the installer. It's going to go ahead and install the 3 other instances of SQL that didn't have an issue. So I'm going to click install. And then start. Once again, if there's any errors, they will be displayed in this user interface. And you can see as it's stepping through all the install steps. Okay, and it's almost done. Okay, there we go. 3 clients installed just like that. So I'm going to click back now. As you can see, there's still one instance there, which is the one that had a warning. So once you've resolved that issue, you can come back into the bulk installer and install it. You can imagine if you were installing 100 instances of SQL, you might have picked up an issue on 5 of them. So you can install the first 95, you'll have the remaining 5 there. You can just resolve whatever the issues were, run the checker again and install those. So you get the idea for how it works. I'm going to close this window and I'm going to go back to our central client overview, and I'm going to hit the refresh button on the top right. So now you can see there are 4 instances of SQL there. So all we've done is we've configured Conductor for SQL to be able to communicate to these 4 instances of SQL. We've set them up in Conductor for SQL. Now you're able to use many of the rich features of Conductor for SQL on your SQL environment. In this example, I've only got 4, but you may have hundreds, for example. So the last thing I'd like to show you is grouping of these instances of SQL, which is very important. So on the left-hand side, you'll see there's an option called Manage Groups. So I'm going to click on that. So what this is, it allows you to group your entire SQL environment to whatever is meaningful for you. You might want to group your instances of SQL by business units, client names, regions, geographical reasons, anything like that. It's completely up to you. So the first thing you'll do is you'll say create group. You'd have to give it a name and a description. I'm going to call this the SQL Express group and give it a description. As this is a grouping, I'm going to put all my Express version instances into. You click save. It says the group's been created. Once it's been created, you can click on the group and the window will appear on the right hand side. Now in the left hand side window are all the instances of SQL you've set up Conductor for SQL on that don't currently belong in this group. On the right hand side you would see instances that already belong to this group. Because it's a new group, there's nothing on the right hand side. So I'm going to choose these 2 instances of SQL because they're Express Edition and add them to the group. As you can see, it's very simple. You can also, if you look at the buttons on the bottom, you can merge groups as well. So if you've grouped together 50 instances of SQL in one group and 50 in another, and at some point it becomes relevant to actually merge them together, you can do it very simply from here. So I'm going to click save. So now what I have in this group is a group with 2 instances of SQL in it that are Express Edition. But this is completely configurable for what makes sense in your organization. You could put 100 instances of SQL in regional groups or anything that makes sense to you. It allows you to be able to work with your SQL environment in meaningful ways across all the features. Another thing we highly recommend is always to create a test group with a few instances in it. So I'm going to create a group. I'm going to call it test group. And I'm just going to go and put 1 instance of SQL in there. I'm going to choose the 2014 instance and click save. What this is for is you can do many powerful things with Conductor for SQL, as you'll see in the later videos. You can distribute DML or DDML scripts. You can distribute queries amongst them. You can synchronize data, audit them, all those different kinds of things. And what we always recommend is before you send out a command or a query, in other words, SQL scripts to your SQL environment, which could be your production environment, always send it to a test group first. This test group can either be a QA or a dev server, or it can be a production server out there in the real world. what you always want to do is send your scripts to that first and make sure that they work before you send it to your entire production environment. Obviously, that's just best practice. Right, so we've shown you today how you can install instances of SQL in your environment onto the Conduct4SQL tool. You can do this one by one through the normal client installer, or you can use the bulk installer to do many instances and roll this out across your SQL environment very quickly. And then also, very importantly, you want to be able to group those instances of SQL so you can work with them in meaningful ways. Be sure to watch the next video in which we'll be showing you some of the really cool features of Conduct4SQL. Thank you.